Welcome to the 1CA podcast. This is your host, Jack Gaines. 1CA is a product of the Civil Affairs Association and brings in people who are current or former military, diplomats, development officers, and field agents to discuss their experiences on ground with the partner nation's people and leadership. Our goal is to inspire anyone interested in working the last 3 feet of foreign relations. To contact the show, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com or look us up on the Civil Affairs Association website at www.civilaffairsassoc.org. I'll have those in the show notes. Please welcome Mickey Bergman, lead author of the book In the Shadows, where he discusses his experiences negotiating the release of hostages and people unlawfully imprisoned in some of the most restrictive places on earth. In the book, Mickey takes the reader through his time working with Governor Bill Richardson, and then after his death, transforming his legacy into a nonprofit called Global Reach. This is the first of a 2-part episode. The second part will air next week. Enjoy. I really appreciate you guys reaching out. I did finish the book. It was great. And in my perception of it, it kind of encapsulates the work and legacy of Governor Richardson, and then that transformation that you had to do with his death into Global Reach. So it was kind of both a historical document and continuing the work through the aggregate of other specialists in the field, and then continuing on with the mission. Is that similar, or am I right on your goals?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's interesting because, look, I wrote the book, obviously, the governor was alive. He hasn't even read it because I was waiting until the manuscript was final in order to share it with him, because the governor, I'll refer to him as Gov, he was like my 6-year-old father. Father figure, but also juvenile as a 6-year-old. And I knew for the first time in his life, somebody else was telling the stories and the role that he played and not him. And that's a great thing to have. And I think it comes out really, really well in the book, but I knew that he's going to nitpick and find something and give me hell for it. So I was really, really dreading the point. And so I wanted to give it to him when it's done.
Sure.
When I can't do anything about it.
It's already published, boss. What can you say?
Yeah. But then he died. And I'm sad that he didn't get to read it. But after he died, I figured that I can't publish a book and not address his death. So basically, I wrote it in one day. I wrote the section to him and telling the story of how I found out, and then touching on the first mission that we did after his death. And that's where Global Reach kind of came in to this. So it was not intentional in the design of the book, but out of circumstances, it was important to convey that this continues. And not only that, the mission to Venezuela, where the book ends with us going, the book does not cover the actual mission and the fact that 13 Americans came home in December, partially because of that mission. So I like that dynamic. At some point, you have to cut.
You have to, because you're constantly on another mission.
Correct, because they just continue to go.
Yeah. Reading that last portion, that was my perception, is you were focused absolutely on a good ceremony and burial for the governor. But this Venezuela issue was on the back of your neck the whole time. And so to me, in reading it, it felt like you were like, all right, the best way to appreciate this is after the ceremony, get back to work and finish his mission, his goals, and then find a path forward from there.
Yeah, and not only that, we had the trip to Venezuela was planned before he died. And we had a whole process. We knew exactly where the deal was stuck. We had an idea for it. We wanted also to make sure that the 2 Green Berets that were there in Venezuela, Luke Denman and Aaron Berry, are included in it because they were never designated by the U.S. government as wrongfully detained. We were very worried that they would not be included. So we needed to get that commitment directly from the Venezuelan leadership to lock them into the deal. And we had that all set up to the extent that the day before the governor died, I actually shared with the families that were going. And then when I got the news the next day, and I was like, the first thing, of course, is the personal grief that you have. The second thing is, oh, shoot, he was my access over there. He had a relationship with Maduro. He had a relationship with Jorge Rodriguez. I was like, oh, my God. And it took about 24 hours to figure out, oh, he would love me to use his death for one last mission of rescue. In the WhatsApp group of the team and of the mission, we called that group the Governor's Last Rescue.
Right. Wow. And That brings up an interesting point, and that is what in the tech community they call the founder's curse. And that is the founder starts a movement or an organization, and they are so entrenched in the details and the process that it's hard for them to separate the program from themselves. And often, if that transformation doesn't happen, the legacy dies with the person.
Correct.
Almost sounds like he brought you in because he was considering his legacy and brought you into the fold and in the details to the point where he didn't predict his death, but he knew that by bringing some people like you and others in to understand the details and the nug work within the negotiations, he was throwing a life preserver to the mission versus passing away and the whole thing just goes flat.
Yeah, well, it's funny because, look, in his mind, he was immoral.
Yeah.
Of course, like typically they are. And he had a huge personality and a huge presence. And I worked with him for 17 years. And, he gave me compliments and then he would balance them with punches. That's typically his management style, which was a lot of fun, right? But in the last couple of years, he had these little sessions with me that were just so uncharacteristic to him. Would just like to say, Mickey, you're better than everybody else just because you don't have a government title. Don't you realize that you get it better than the high officials? So he was very encouraging from that perspective, but he never spoke to me about what happens after. That is a conversation that we had without him, with his board, not because we expected him to die. Obviously, he died too soon on us. There was no underlying disease there or something that was expected. It was a surprise, but his mortality was not a surprise.
Yeah.
And so we had that conversation. And then with the board, immediately after, with the board of directors of the organization, because you're right, it's not the first government organization that I work with. I've seen the founder's curse. I've seen what happened. And immediately after the founder's death, and not even stepping away and retiring, just death, there is so much emotions and nostalgia because the board is made of his friends.
Right. Or chaos because no one knows all of the different things that are going on in the process and they have to rediscover it.
Yeah. But emotionally, we were all, including myself, like, oh my God, we have to create a legacy. We have to continue with this. And everybody's like, no, we'll step in. We'll make sure it happens. And I remember the day after his funeral, breakfast with the board, just informal. It wasn't a board meeting. It was just breakfast, just to debrief. And I told him, look, the governor and I actually had a conversation after Kofi Annan passed away. The Kofi Annan Foundation kept the name and they wanted to keep this because they were thrown in with that kind of emotional response to it. But we talked about how it just feels like all they're doing right now is fundraising full time just to keep the lights on. But there's no substance left. And it's a miserable way for an organization to die out. And so I raised it with the board. I said, look, we can try. We can see if there's sustainability in it just for a couple of months to see where things settle. But I know that despite our very raw emotions right now, life continues and life happens. And I do not want to spend all of our time just keeping the lights on because that's not what he would love. He wanted to find a way to keep the work going. So if we can't keep it as Richardson Center and there is a law of diminishing returns on the name, let me work and put a proposal in front of the board of what it looks like to do the different pieces of this legacy. One, of course, hostages and prisoners, which is a huge chunk, and that came out to be global reach. Another one was around the program we did with the Rohingyas and humanitarian work that we did, and that we basically have moved it, found a different home for it. It's going to continue at the Stimson Center instead of the Richardson Center, with the funder that funded it is moving there, with our guy, Steve Ross, who's the director of that program. So he's moving over there as well. And third, I wanted more of a name legacy piece. And that's when we established and announced the Bill Richardson Heart of a Patriot Award, which we hope will be known as the Billy. We're trying to make that stick. And that's going to be awarded every year at the Foley Foundation Gala. And the award is going to be given to former political and policy principals that after leaving government use their credentials and their gravitas to help bring Americans home.
Well, let's just make it stick. Let's just start calling it the Billy Awards.
I like the Billy.
The Billies.
It's going. The Oscars, we have the Billy.
Well, I apologize if I cut you off on your string, but that makes total sense. So how do you guys stay afloat? If it's something sensitive, I won't add it to the show.
Oh, no, absolutely. No, we're here, as you can tell, we're an open book. We love that. So we were lucky enough that during the pandemic, because there was just no commercial flights, but we still had hostages and we still needed to go there and get people out. And the governor has met an American businessman named Steve Menzies. He's an insurance guy out of Omaha. He runs a reinsurance company called Applied Underwriters.
Ah,
And he's done very well for himself financially. But he's one of those, you don't see him flying rockets to space. He's a quiet guy. He does his thing. And he and the governor got to this. He said, hey, you can use my jet for some of these missions, especially places that you can't go commercially.
right.
But I'm coming with you.
Of course, he wants the experience. He wants to feel a part of the cause.
Yeah, he came with us in the middle of the pandemic on a mission to Venezuela. Later on, he did a few other missions with us to Russia, including the return and recovery of the Taylor Dudley. That was a month after Brittany Griner came home, and we went to Russia and got the former Navy guy, Taylor Dudley, out.
That's the one where you're driving through Poland.
That is correct.
Book, right?
And that was Steve's plane. But it's not only his plane. At that point, he already started integrating his logistics skills into this and helping us really set this up. And so when the governor passed away, Steve and I sat together and he said, Mickey, we have to continue this. Not only for the name of his legacy, but for the work that it is. And he says, but I'm no Governor Richardson. I know that what he did with you was unique. So you tell me, Mickey, if you didn't have budget constraints, how would you build that and structure this in a post-Richardson world to be not only as good as what you did, but better?
Yeah.
And so he gave me basically a blank check to put a structure together. And we looked at, the piece of what we did with the governor, which was this intergovernmental mediation and negotiations. And on that, I said, well, I'm going to run that part, but I'm not going to replace Governor Richardson with a single person because there isn't such one person.
Right. You needed an aggregate.
Yeah. I wanted a bunch of people that we have worked with over the years, former diplomats, former politicians, Republicans, Democrats, business people. It doesn't matter. The people who are actively in this and have the relationships. And just to have them to agree, they're not going to get into the organization, they're not going to manage it or run it, but they agree that we can call on them if we need them to be a principal in a case. And that's something that to me, over the years of working with the governor, there were every now and then, there would be an occasion and a location in which his relationships were not good.
Sure.
And there would be somebody else. So whether it's in terms of timing, like actually right now, it would be better to have a Republican do that, something like that, step into it. And I would suggest it to him and he would say, no, it was the Richardson Center. Like, it's us. Every now and then he would let me do that, but that was a little bit of a constraint. And I wanted to make sure that I don't set up a new organization with similar constraints. And we're assembling that board. We have about 6 people on that board already, on that advisory board, and they're fantastic. And it's like different else and different walks of life and different political affiliation. And they're all like, we staff it. We put together the theory of return. We build up the thing, and then we call on them to actually be the face of it and bring their gravitas. And it's working on wood here. It's working up to now pretty well. So that's one. Steve told me, actually, he said, but beyond what you did with Richardson, are there other capabilities in our field that still don't exist within outside of government? Because he says, I have the resources and I have the ability to do that. And that's when we realized, wait a minute, there's capabilities around investigative capabilities. There are research capabilities. It's not writing research papers.
Backgrounders on people you're going to be dealing with, culture, the relationships.
Yeah.
Relationship mapping. Absolutely.
If we have a hostage, and I'll give you one example in which both of these came into play. There's a Princeton PhD student, Elizabeth Serkov, and she was kidnapped in Iraq in March of last year, so almost a year and a half ago. And at first, nobody knew where the hell she was. We knew that she was kidnapped, but we didn't know by who. And in Iraq, you never know which militia, which group, yes, government, not government, Shia, Sunni, you never know. And everybody was trying to figure out how to do it. And Steve walked into this. And this is before Global Reach was actually established. Steve walks into it and said, wait a minute, I can buy the cell data of the exact area where she know the coffee place when we know she was kidnapped.
Yeah.
And we knew that she had the emergency back surgery 8 days before. So we knew the medicine that her captors will have to pick up in order to keep her healthy. Otherwise, she's not worth anything to them. And so he bought that data too. And then he shared that data with the FBI. Our own people analyze it. And we traced phones that were in the coffee place on the day that she was kidnapped, and then phones that picked up that medicine.
Right. And so you could correlate between the different digital signals and
Exactly.
triangulate the location. Absolutely.
Exactly. And found
I've
her.
never
Like found
experienced that in my life.
found yeah, of course not. Never, nobody. And we're able to find her, not the exact house, but a village where she's being held. And again, our government has the capability to do it.
But the risk of going in with ground forces or CIA to actually work, humit, and negotiate with people to find her location is way too risky for a government organization.
It's costly. There's a lot of red tape, and we're able to move it like that. And so that's the investigative part that we never had before. Richardson, I would never have had that just because of resources. He would have loved it, but we didn't have the resources for this. And so that's something that added. And then in terms of once we realized where she's at, we started researching, we realized which militia has its headquarters over there. So at that point, we had a pretty good confidence of who has her. And once you know who has her, you're able to do different things in order to solicit a proof of life from them. And in November, it took 8 months of nobody hearing from her. In November, we got a video with a proof of life from her. And that allows us, I can't go into the details what happened since because it's an ongoing case. She's still there and we're working really hard on it. But the point is that these are capabilities that we never had before outside of government. And we're not in competition with government. We actually collaborate because we're able to accelerate things. And trust me, there are people at the FBI extremely happy that somebody else is buying this stuff and giving it to them. Because then it's like we're giving them a bunch of toys as well to look at. And there's results. And we all have the same exact intention, is getting people back home.
Sure.
So that's kind of the birth of Global Reach. And so for the first time, it's not just the governor and me and an advisor. I actually have a team of executives.
Right.
I had Rob Saleh, who's the director of the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell at the FBI. I think I kind of dragged him out of retirement just to help us set it up. And he's fantastic.
Would you take pictures with his kids at the ice cream store saying, hey, come on down and get a scoop and we'll talk about it?
He's a great guy and he's a good friend. And we worked together while he was in service. And so we were able to convince him to come in, at least to help us set it up.
Sure.
I don't think he'll say he's set up for retirement. He's done.
Yeah.
But he helps us set it up and then until we find a permanent person to run it. So there is that kind of caliber that we didn't have before. One of the first decisions we made when we established Global Reach, and Steve Menzies is the co-founder of it and the chairman, and I'm the CEO, was to look at the other organizations in our field, namely the Foley Foundation and Hostage US. Each of them are unique and effective organizations, but they do things that we don't do. Advocates in government. They give a government report card every year. They change policies. They work with families in the general advocacy. Hostage US, they help families physically and with taxes, with social work, with therapists, a bunch of volunteers going and helping because these families need it while their loved ones in captivity and when they come back. And that's Hostage US. We don't do that. They do that and they're damn good at it. And so we looked at who is their biggest donor and each of these organizations, and we matched that because we had the resources. So we became funders of them. And that's how you create within an environment of non-for-profits the competition over resources, which prohibits you from collaborating even if you really need to. We completely dismantle that. So we're working extremely closely. The three large non-for-profit entities in this field are working extremely closely in supporting each other. So when I have a case, I immediately bring in Foley Foundation for the functions that they can serve for the families. And I immediately bring Hostage US for the part that they serve that we can't do.
And actually, it saves from building those specific functions within Global Reach, because then you're just competing with the same skills and people to do the job. So it makes sense that you would have built a network of networks that is an umbrella of all of the hostage support services that are out there.
Yeah, and they're very good at it. All we do is provide them additional funding so they can be even better. And Nizar sits with the CSIS Commission on wrongful detention and hostages. And again, it's another government commission. John Alterman is running it with Jason Rezaian, who's a former prisoner, and Robert O'Brien, Donald Trump's former national security advisor. And it's a bunch of us. Nizar sits on that commission with me and with a lot of other leaders in this field. But that commission is looking at ways to recommend to the next administration, whoever that is, get a report on how to do deterrence policies. What are the parameters of how to look at these kind of negotiations and what are the best practices on this and what are the things that can do better, because we do know this is a national security crisis.
Have you heard of hostage aid?
Hostage aid worldwide. Yes, of course. Zal Zaka is the head of it. And that organization is made of former hostages and volunteers, and their niche of what they're trying to get beyond the advocacy that they're doing mainly online, they're trying to build data.
Right. And the thing is, by doing that, I think that the State Department's notices on travel advisories would be more effective. Because if they could put in there that there is a steady increase or there's a predicted increase of hostage taking in a country, American citizens will read that and say, well, now I know I've got to either stay in the hotel or not go.
Yeah, it's true. I have to tell you, Americans, they don't. Look, I'll give you an example. But Turks and Caicos wanted to crack down on the fact that Americans were traveling into the island for some reason with ammunition, not with guns, not with arms, but with ammunition. Some of it was just careless, but it became a big issue politically in Turks and Caicos. And so all policy is domestic. And there was kind of a fight of who's going to be stronger on crime, on American crime, of bringing ammunition into the island. So they put a law in that a required sentence for anybody who's bringing ammunition into the island is 12 years.
Right.
And then they had to implement it. And before we knew it, there was a whole bunch of Americans who were detained and on trial on their sure way to have 12 years of imprisonment.
See you next week for the second half of the Mickey Bergman interview. Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or hosting an episode, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have the email and CA Association website in the show notes. And now, most importantly, to those currently out in the field, working with a partner nation's people or leadership to forward U.S. relations, thank you all for what you're doing. This is Jack, your host. Stay tuned for more great episodes. 1CA Podcast.